And we're off. Hey, I am so excited to get talking to Corey Keyes. We have a little programming change. Kerry can't be here today. She's got something else going on. Corey wrote a book called Languishing. And this was, Kerry had arranged to have this conversation, but I had a chance to read the book, so I think I'm close enough to this. This book is about how to feel alive again in a world that wears us down. So we have a whole lot of cool stuff to cover. There's so much stuff to get into. I'm going to just start.
Hi, everyone. Tim Kitzer from NBA Jam and NFL Blitz, welcoming you to The Backpack Show. Your hosts, Chris Brogan, Kerry Gorgone, Boom Shakalaka.
Backpack Show.
I cannot wait to have this conversation because this book is the perfect post-pandemic book. I feel like it should just be issued out. Like if you go to a store and you've got to buy, you're getting ready to go on an airplane flight and you got to buy a couple masks and you're sort of thinking in your head, the pandemic's over. The other thing that this book does is reminds you how much damage you sustained during the pandemic in some ways. Not that that's an intent of the book, but it sure reminds you as you read it, because you will now learn today a little bit about languishing and what that means. So I'm going to drag Corey Keyes in here. And we'll start asking some questions. Hi, Corey. Welcome on board.
Good morning.
Your audio vanished. I lost your audio. Don't know if that's me or you. Oh, now I got you. So,
well, am I back? Good
You're
morning,
back.
Chris.
We made it. Phew. This book, Languishing, it's a fascinating read. One of the things I like the most about it is that it kind of, the premise, the first portion of the book, the first segment of the book tells us what to understand, what to identify, what it is to languish. And then we go into some ways to deal with it. And one of the things that I find a lot of times in books in the sort of this neighborhood is that they either spend a real lot of time on how to deal with it, but you're not sure if you even have that problem. And so you can't self-identify, or they spend a real lot of time telling you about the problem and in the end give you pretty frivolous feedback. Mm-hmm. Can we start with that question, which is, how did you decide to structure this information? I mean, you have a PhD, you've done a lot of lecturing and work like that. How do you decide this is the format I'm going to make with these nice people at Penguin, well, Crown, I guess? How do you pick what's going to be in the book and sort of structure that information in a way that people could read it without you there lecturing?
Well, I was blessed with a wonderful editor and team at Crown, and my approach was to put everything in to begin with, so we did cut back probably to the two chapters at least, but the structure was always there, Chris. I did not want to spend the entire time trying to tell the story of sort of the theoretical, the background, and not really spend a lot of time on what to do, because I've spent a lot of my life trying to figure out what it is that I need to do to promote my own mental health. And I wanted to tell that story along with giving other people something that they could use to work on their own.
In the process of going through this, you give a lot of information to help people identify. I figure maybe one starting question would be, can you talk a little bit about the difference between languishing and depression? I'm a guy with clinical depression, which is basically doesn't matter what I do or don't think about per se. I mean, obviously, but chemically I need to fix a problem before I can get to it. That's not the same thing. Can you explain the difference?
Sure. The first thing to note is there's very little overlap in the questions that I use to identify mental health in its absence, or what I call flourishing and languishing. The only question that overlaps a little, Chris, is the question about, have you had an interest in life? And that I ask to identify languishing or flourishing. And so that's also a question that's on the psychiatric list for depression. After that, they are vastly different beasts. As you know, if you've gone through the list, I have depression myself. They're all questions about the presence of negative emotions or negative symptoms, or what we call malfunctioning. My questionnaire that I use to identify mental health has every question is framed positively and has to do with the things that have to do with meaning in life, if you will, if I had to give it one term or umbrella. So, and the other thing is that I've done so many studies where I've measured both depression and languishing and flourishing. It's far more common that people are languishing but don't come close to the diagnosis for depression. So there is this middle ground that we talk about, and I talk about in the book, that people called the middle child, which is languishing. A lot of people aren't depressed. They're not even anxious. They don't have a mental disorder, but they're not mentally healthy.
I like that distinction a lot. I love the fact that there's a breadth to it. You also talked a little bit about kind of identifying the domains of human I can't remember, excellence that contribute to flourishing. I saw autonomy in there, acceptance, I'm trying to remember, competence, mastery. So
competence,
I like
connection.
There's a path from you identify that you're languishing, you kind of say, oh shoot, maybe I shouldn't languish. Do I want to think of those domains first, or do I want to, skip a bunch of pages and be thinking about the 5 vitamins? Like, in what order, I can't find my camera, in what order do humans process all this? They say to themselves, man, I've been languishing. Yeah. I realize it's time for me to kind of get myself out of the hole now. What's the method? What do we do?
Well, I would want to rein the horse in a little bit before we get to the 5 vitamins, because if we only had to stare at one thing, it would be those 14 questions that are very early in the book. You could actually discard the domains of excellence. That's an attempt of mine to summarize where those 14 questions sort of fit. But you can ignore that and simply look at the questions themselves as a way to begin to understand that if you feel that you're languishing, and then if you answer those questions in a way where you have enough of them, whether you're absent of those good things, then you really want to know, well, when did I lose my sense of purpose or direction in life? Where, if ever, did I have a sense that the world was challenging me to become a better person, what I call personal growth? So the way to think about languishing is that something really good has gone missing. And it's an alarm. It's an alarm bell. And too many of the times we don't pay attention to that alarm, just like many mornings we hit snooze. And my message to people is stop hitting the snooze button when you feel like you're languishing. Go and face the fact that something good has gone missing. And you're likely to find it on that page where there's those 14 questions.
Those questions included things like, do I remember feeling good at any point in the last little while? And those sorts of things. One question I had when I was looking through that, again, I'm still sort of slicing a little of this onion about the mental health side of it. This is an interesting part of, like, there's such a spread of places you could have put your focus, and you picked this little corner to start painting in for languishing. Why this? Why this out of all the other things that you felt like you could approach? Is it because of all the positive ways that you've seen things before, and this was another way to get at that?
Well, it was actually just the opposite, Chris. I had struggled mightily, and the reason I went down this path as an academic and as a scholar was I was looking for something more that sustained me in my recovery. In my recovery from PTSD and depression, I simply found that it wasn't enough. It was important, but it wasn't enough to deal with the psychiatric side of things. If successful, psychiatry helps us, and clinical psychologists help us mitigate, lessen those negative symptoms, but lowering the bad does not mean you suddenly are catapulted to having the presence of those things that go into my questionnaire. You can get stuck in the middle And that's what happened to me a couple of years after I was adopted at age 12 and put into this home with my grandparents that was loving, safe, nurturing. And I was suddenly removed from a very negative environment of abuse. And suddenly the negative was gone, but I had all this good stuff going on around me. But when I sort of settled at the end of the day, I suddenly started experiencing emptiness. And psychiatry and clinical psychology do not have an answer to what it is that we would promote if we were to take mental health seriously as more than the absence of mental illness. So that's what started me on this journey. Mental health was an empty category. It was invisible. Nobody studied it. And in fact, we assumed that if people were free of mental illness, that they were mentally healthy. And I knew in my own gut personally that was not true. And so I went looking for the very things that I call my North Star that became the ingredients for flourishing.
That's interesting, because even having gone through some of this material, it didn't glue in my head the difference between when like medical people look for problems versus the wellness industry. That this is the mental health. Like, I was just using the label the way other people do, which is I'm going to say mental health, but what I really mean is what's wrong with you. Yeah. And you're saying that there's a vast gap, which is where you
very, very different. Yes. So, and I'm trying to reclaim the word mental health because, and that's why at the beginning, Chris, I had to use a different word. That's why I chose the word flourishing, because I wanted people to know when I use that word mental health, I'm talking about the presence of some very good things.
Right.
Yes. And that is the ingredient. And we can get into all the studies that show that when you reach that place, you stay in recovery from mental illness far longer. And I found that out personally before we even did the research, that when I started moving in the direction of flourishing, the risk of me relapsing or sliding back into depression, it went down vastly. I stay mentally healthy when I'm experiencing those ingredients of flourishing, like purpose, belonging, contribution, acceptance, and growth.
So I want to get to, in sort of service of that, the only bookmark I kept in was the 5 vitamins. I wanted to get to the 5 vitamins so that people understand, especially because if someone comes and leaves fast, I want them to get the info before they vanish on it. By the way, hi, Tamara. Tamara said, removing negative doesn't build positive.
Exactly.
One of our deep thinkers.
Yes.
Your 5 vitamins, follow your curiosity to learn something new. Build warm and trusting relationships. I'm reading right out of the page so I don't blow any of these. Move closer to the sacred, the divine, and the infinite. Some form of, spiritual practice of some kind or meditation. Have and live your purpose. You tilted on that a minute for the North Star and everything. And also my favorite, for reasons, play. Make time where the activities where you enjoy the process, not the outcome. I love all 5, but I'll start with my selfish question. Is it okay to have a favorite, or do I have to be a balanced kind of a person?
It's okay to have favorites, yes.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay. So beyond that, do you think, in explaining that, any of those 5, let me just ask that question then. What's your favorite? What's your favorite of the 5?
Oh, no one's asked me that question, Chris. And may I be a little political and say that I really, really don't. I really seriously, sincerely do not have a favorite. And that's a point I want to make. The research that I review in the book for the second half about the 5 vitamins, it doesn't mean you have to do all 5 every day or every week. But it's far better if you try to do more of them. If you choose 1 a day, do more of it, or as much as possible. But I suspect each one of them brings a slightly different piece of the flourishing puzzle into the fore. Like, for instance, play. I mean, play is a great way to start feeling happy or interested in life again. But playing in a way that is just about fun. Because,
Right.
right, play begins to engage you in a way where your mind literally opens. And when that mind is open, you become curious about what's going on inside of you and around you. And not focused on the negative, but on what's growing. And it makes you curious. I mean, kids at play become absorbed. That absorption isn't just because they're losing time. They're very curious and they get engaged. And so, but we don't always play alone. I mean, most of the time we play with others. And so you're starting to connect and build
Right.
warm, trust, right? So I can't choose one because each one does something unique, but they blur into each other.
I hope I remember what I'm going to ask you next, but I'm going to give Michael the floor because he had a good question. I came to a realization, and you're either going to hate it or love it. Michael says, what would be the recommendation to people who are struggling through the fog of depression to get to flourishing?
Yeah. Michael, the study that I based the second half of my book on also included people with clinical depression. So that was measured. So there were 3 groups in this study. A group that was depressed, and the rest of the people weren't depressed, but they were either languishing to some degree or they were flourishing. And here's what they found. Those 5 vitamins, those 5 activities, if you're flourishing, you needed to do more of those on a regular basis, because if you stopped doing them, you began to slide into languishing. If you're depressed, just like if you're languishing, those 2 groups that began to do more of the 5 vitamins began to have what was the study measured in terms of having better days. Now, at the beginning, it's very small. And I was there myself. I had to start small, but each small step, I started to experience a better day. And as you had better days, you began to believe in doing more of those things, and you started to move out of depression towards flourishing. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. I don't make false promises, and I don't do any cheerleading in the book. It's not my style. I've had to struggle a lot, and I don't want to give anyone the false notion that in a month you're going to go from depression to flourishing. But you will move out of depression and start moving towards flourishing. Those 5 vitamins were just as relevant to people with depression as they were for people with languishing, and they were very relevant to people who are flourishing. Again, if you stop doing it, you stop flourishing.
I'm going to tell you what I was thinking as you were going on. It was the first domino that fell was when it dawned on me that you meant more than what you were saying when you were saying mental health, that you were reclaiming wellness and all that. That lit my synapses went, I get it. I know what he's trying to say. I'm going to have to reread the book a different way. But I have been, and I am by no means a scholar. I am horrific, but I am a thirst for knowledge person. I'm reading Julia Ender's book, Gut, about gut biome. I'm fascinated by everything I never knew about gut biomes. And what I was thinking, when you were saying what you were saying, when you were saying about the 5 vitamins and everything, I started thinking about all the things you're supposed to eat, like fermented foods and all this kind of stuff to restore and fix your gut biome. But the language is almost similar to what you're saying in Languishing, which is to say, number 1, you can eat this good for you stuff, whether or not you fixed everything else. Number 2, everything is kind of additive. So the more things you do, the more ways you can kind of help yourself out. They interplay with each other. Do you see where I'm going? It feels like this is what you wrote as well in a different way. So there's kind of an as above, so below in what I'm reading, what you said. How do you feel now that I said all those words?
That's a beautiful way to put it, Chris. And the fact of the matter is, if you want to think of those as vitamins, it's a multivitamin. Each one has, one is vitamin C. Think of it that one is vitamin D, and right, they're all necessary for creating a stronger version of your mental health. And I want to say one last thing to the gentleman who had that wonderful question, because it's extremely relevant, because I have depression, and I talked about staying in recovery. Well, we've done 3 studies now, and we've shown the following, that if you're left languishing after you've had treatment, even if your treatment for your mental illness is successful, more often than not, you will be left with some degree of languishing. And the more severe your languishing, the more likely and faster you will relapse. We've shown that in 3 separate studies, that the key to of your recovery isn't stopping just because suddenly you've lowered the mental illness symptoms. Then here's this book that's telling you, begin the journey of sustained recovery, because the closer you get to flourishing, the lower your risk of recurrence and relapse. And that's extremely important, because psychiatry does a wonderful job, and clinical psychology can do a wonderful job lowering the bad. But what they don't realize is a lot of people who end up with mental illnesses have some degree of languishing that comes along with it. And just because you've had treatment for the mental illness doesn't mean it's addressed the absence of good mental health. It doesn't address languishing necessarily. In fact, I have data on that. More often than not, it lowers the bad, but that leaves you languishing. And we don't realize that. And so once we're done with mental illness treatment, we have to also then begin our own journey towards that North Star. That's why I call it the North Star. That's where you're going to find your home, where you're safe, you're secure, you're stable, you're in a good place. I'll stop there.
If it's not clear, Corey's use of North Star is way better than other people who use it. We hear that term a lot in motivational speakers and business people and marketing people, and your version is vastly different, and it's covered also in language.
Yes.
You're bringing it deeper. Everything you've said and everything you've wanted to touch on is a deeper version of things that you've heard a different way. And that's kind of that. My revelation is that it's almost like what Covey said in the 80s about the 7 habits was, when you get to the end of the 7 habits, you should start over again, because you're going to see it all different again, and you should pay attention. I realized I'm going to have to take a second walk through Languishing to get there. So we've come to the part of the show where we do a couple quick things and then move on. One of them's real quick.
Oh, and here's our person of the day. Kaboom!
Every time Tim Kitzrow's voice shows up, it makes me cheery. We'll give it to Michael. Michael hasn't even been visiting the show lately, so I'm glad he got it. So you're the person of the day. Michael, that entitles you to 1 free apple. Just remember to run into a store, grab the apple, and leave before anyone notices. Feel free to eat it. You don't even have to wash it, because Kerry's not here to tell you to wash it. There's that part. Then there's a question we've asked every guest who's ever been on the show. So we are going to get you right here into this universe by asking this question. What goes in your backpack? So Corey Keyes, this could be something physical. It could be something like hope for the future. We had a clown from Clowns Without Borders say an avocado, because it's got a delicious food, but also afterwards you get that pit and you can play games with it. Corey Keyes, what can we add to the backpack, either physical or metaphorical, for you today?
I read about this in the acknowledgement to my book. I put someone in my backpack on August 16th, 1986. A woman I married and I couldn't and wouldn't want to do this journey through life alone, nor could I ever, and nor could anyone. To have someone who loves and understands you, accepts you, and knows your imperfections and believes in your growth, and do that for each other. I can't think of a greater asset to put in my backpack. It's been there since 1986.
Love that answer. Well, I was thinking about what you were saying at that same moment. I was thinking about who would I throw in my backpack if I threw a person in my backpack. And I have an answer. I think it would be